Hey everyone, and welcome back to another skill. So in this skill right here, we have a lot of stuff to get to, but the very first thing that we're going to focus on is the Linux boot process. Now, the Linux boot process comprises of multiple different steps. We have to understand what those steps are. And well, the very first thing that we should do is talk about the first step in that process, of course. So the very first process, or rather step in the process, should I say, is what is called the BIOS. Now, the BIOS stands for the Basic Input Output System. And the first thing to understand about the BIOS is that this is not related to Linux. In fact, it's not related to the operating system itself. This is actually to do with the hardware on your computer. Now, what is going to happen is that when you push the power button on your computer to turn it on, BIOS is going to effectively take action. Now, what the BIOS is going to do, it's going to perform something known as the post. This is the power on self test. Now, all the post is going to do, it's going to just do some basic hardware checks. So this could be things like checking your keyboards are operational, so on and so forth, just some very basic low-level checks. Now, crucially, what the BIOS is going to do, it's going to be responsible for booting the operating system. But the question is, from where? So what do I mean when I say that? Well, think about it. It may actually be not obvious that the operating system can be booted from different locations. Typically, this is going to come in the form of your hard drive. That is where the operating system is going to be installed. But you can have things such as removable media. Say, for example, you could have an operating system stored on a USB stick. Now, when the BIOS is engaged, we can ultimately select whereabouts we want to try to find this operating system. Should we check the hard drive first, or should we check for removable media? Should we check for CD-ROMs, whatever it may be? But the key thing here is that the BIOS is going to search whatever location you tell it to, be it the hard drive or the USB, whatever it may be. The thing that the BIOS is going to look for, and this is very, very crucial, the BIOS is going to look for the presence of an MBR. This is the master boot record. Now, so long as the BIOS can find the MBR, everything is A-OK. The process can then continue. So really, if we happen to have a particular order, i.e. we want to search the hard drive first for an MBR, if the BIOS finds an MBR, we're going to load it from the hard drive. However, if it does not find it from the hard drive, it can then go down the chain to the next thing we have specified in our order of operations. Maybe that could be the USB or the CD-ROM or a network-based drive. Nevertheless, whatever it may be, so long as we find this MBR, which happens to be very tiny indeed, this is only 512 bytes after all, but these are very important bytes. They happen to be located at the very first sector of the disk. And so long as the BIOS can find that MBR, it will then attempt to load the operating system. So really, once the MBR runs, the next stage is the bootloader is going to take effect. Now, to note, there are different bootloaders available on Linux. The very first bootloader is one called Lilo. And the thing to note about Lilo is that it's kind of old and antiquated. You're not going to see it very much at all in modern-based systems, if at all in a modern-based system. And Lilo is Linux specific. This is the Linux loader. But ultimately, this was replaced by the Grand Unified Bootloader, otherwise known as Grub. Now, Grub itself has since been replaced with Grub 2, which is really just the updated version of Grub. And this really is the one that you're going to see all over the place in modern Linux-based systems. But the thing here about Grub is that Grub is not just a Linux-based bootloader the way Lilo is. Grub indeed can be used on other operating systems such as Windows. Now, when the bootloader happens to run, you maybe happen to see a splash menu. So a splash menu is just going to splash onto your screen, and it's going to actually show you the different operating systems that you have available to you. So let's maybe say you happen to have your hard disk and you partition it, maybe you have a Linux operating system here, let's maybe say Ubuntu, and you also have a Windows operating system on the same disk. This would be known as a dual boot scenario. So let's maybe say you loved Linux for your system administration based stuff, but you happen to really like the gaming ecosystem of Windows. You wanted to have both. The bootloader, such as Grub2, is going to allow you to select which operating system we actually want to boot into. Now, whatever bootloader you're using, whether it is Lilo, whether it is Grub, we have a primary purpose here. That bootloader is going to load the kernel into memory. Now, this is a very, very important step. The kernel, as you may know, is a very important part of the operating system. It happens to be the core of the operating system. And basically, this kind of has control over absolutely everything. So getting this to load into memory is a crucial component. Without this happening, your system is not going to work. Now, once the kernel has successfully loaded into memory, we're then going to transition to the next phase. This is called the kernel initialization phase. So once the kernel has been loaded into memory, what it's going to do, it's going to load, at least in modern systems, systemd. Now, systemd has a massive responsibility in modern Linux systems. It's going to mount the file systems. It's going to also handle the running and stopping of all the processes on the system. But crucially to note is that systemd is a newer implementation. On older systems, you may see different styles of programs, such as sysvinit. Now, whether you happen to be running sysvinit or systemd, essentially the same type of thing is going to happen. They're going to be responsible for controlling those processes that are going to get your system fully up and running. So really, as a recap, the process is going to be, the very first step is going to be the BIOS, which will do our basic checks for hardware. The BIOS is then going to try to find the MBR on some type of media, let's say a network drive or a hard drive or a USB. The MBR is then going to run the bootloader. So that could maybe be Grub2. And the bootloader is going to be responsible for loading the kernel into memory. So then we have our kernel initialization. And the kernel will load, in modern systems at least, systemd, which is going to mount your file system and begin running all of those essential processes to get your operating system up and running. So that really is us for the basics of the Linux boot process. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.